I will now provide some brief comments and perhaps a question or two concerning this reading of other people's money and how the bankers use it. The first thing I want to address is the consideration of the, as he puts it, home market. You know, it's a very compelling thing. We live in a world now. They talk about globalization or globalism, this concept of interconnectivity. And a lot of times, a considerable amount of pressure is applied to compelling us to try to consider ourselves and our lives as reflected in places very distinctly different from where we are and where we come from. This is a very important matter, this concept of pride in one's home, pride in one's place. You could talk of it in a form of patriotism, but you could also talk of it as a form of understanding your place in your community. And by understanding your place in your community, also understanding your self interest. Understanding one's self interest and being honest with it is, I believe, one of the most important matters when it comes to trying to engage relations with others. So the pressure to try to extrapolate or project onto another place some sort of understanding of the context of your life. In another matter, especially with today's actual financial relations and arrangements, it's not merely just a reflection or a projection. The expropriation of people's personal private property, including intangible property, that is allowed to be circulated by other people, including through and in connection with how it has been acquired through banks to then be made available for their securities operations and in consideration of how their securities operations impact other sectors, including the insurance sector and including the home mortgage sector, which until the last couple of decades, but following the writing of this book, were highly regulated in a manner they are not now. These are very important matters for consideration when we discuss this concept of home markets. But more than that, he brings up another matter which is important, which is the railroad, specifically in this case, the Pennsylvania Railroad. He makes a specific reference to the number of stations and how those stations could potentially provide another consideration when it comes to the circulation of securities associated with railroads. I'm currently located in the state of Texas, and I have come to consider Texas to be a home for myself. I have never lived in one place very long. This is part of my history. It's part of what I understand my father committed to when he joined the military. And I would move from city to city when I was a young person. And while I lived in one city, Chicago, for a total of 14 years, I also moved from there. And I'm now in Texas. I've been in Texas for 4 years. And I would be very happy to say that Texas is my home, despite not being born in Texas. Not only that, but the history of Texas, including the conception of the Republic of Texas, was one that was very much about understanding that when there is a need that a people have for assistance and support, and they request outside assistance and support, that those that provide the assistance that come to the call and are there are a part of what is created by virtue of being there with and among the people and among the struggle. It's not easy, but it's not meant to be. And this is part of the history of Texas. The first governors of Texas, they weren't born in Texas. The first legislators in Texas, they weren't born in Texas. The specifics of the development, for instance, of the very particular law enforcement structure, including the Texas Rangers, were based upon understandings of relationships that had been made concerning people that weren't from Texas. And so understanding this is a very important thing. And it gives Texas a very, I believe, significant, important, and valuable history. The problem is who gets to determine how that is not only invested, but how it is valuated. Who appraises your own history? Who has the right to set the determinations of its worth and value, and then make it available for circulation? To whom does it circulate? Before coming to Texas, I had an opportunity to read through some information that was going on in the United States before the establishment of the Federal Reserve Bank. And one of the things it discussed specifically was the role of the railroads in connecting major municipal areas to more outer lying areas, including areas that had significant agricultural basis or that would have a specific kind of trade that was developed in that area, and how that specific area had its own concept not only of banking, but also in terms of currency. And that these sort of peripheral or alternative arrangements that local communities were making based upon what they understood to be the underlying value of their money and their trade relationships that may not even need a fiat currency, but could potentially engage in either some form of direct exchange or something comparable to a system of credits, whereby people had access to commodities that were a part of their local or indigenous culture and then could be valuated as a form of local trade. Now, this was the kind of banking system that was developing outside of the major metropolitan areas, specifically in the Northeast, but not exclusively. But then, with the Great Depression, the stock market crash, which is something we're going to get to at some point, and then with the manner in which the central banking system ended up being founded, implemented, and moving forward, that was all but done away with. And it wasn't just done away with functionally. I've only been able to find one source of information about that specific period of time and the specific distinct manners in which those areas were developing their own localized systems for understanding what was appropriate commercial relationships with others, either locally or even in a more distant and extended form. I believe the spirit of that goes all the way back to the beginning of the United States. Before I happened upon this book, I began reading another book. It's actually a series of primary source documents from the founding of the United States, even before the history of the American banking system. And one of the things it includes is a document that's very important. Starting next week, I am going to augment, or rather complement, my readings of Louis Brandeis with readings of Benjamin Franklin, starting with his analysis of the money system. What is money? Where does it come from? Here's a very, very compelling piece that Benjamin Franklin wrote at a very, very important time frame. The circumstances around it are ones that not only stimulate me in my imagination and my sense of belonging, but also provide a more appropriate context, I think, and other kinds of considerations that refuse at least to understand that we're hundreds of years down the road. We develop laws. We develop systems. We developed processes and structures of accountability, and refusal to apply them appropriately devalues them. Might be time to remind ourselves of what the original value was, so that maybe we can recomport ourselves to understand what we should have to work with right now that isn't being applied or invested as wisely as it otherwise could.